Hi there, Isha here, and welcome to The Higher Life, where we're exploring the great change that is moving through humanity at the moment and how we can upskill as individual human beings to really have agency and participate in this unfolding as it happens in real time. And if you've been following my episodes for a while now, you'll know that over at least the last 5 years, I've been focusing on developing an inner competency that every human being has access to. Maybe not everyone has access to it at the same resonance, but we all share this capability, this personal agency to be able to focus our energy and our attention in a specific way to generate a continuity, one could say, in what we choose to honor as we move forward in our lives and what we're willing to challenge and to dissolve or to no longer energize. And when I talk about energy, I'm not talking about manifestation. I'm really talking about how we go about energizing our day-to-day lives and the kind of relationships that we focus on, the quality of the way we relate inside those relationships, what we value as being a worthy use of our time, our relationship to time in general. These are all ways as a singular human being you can become a lot more conscious of your true agency, not only in your day-to-day life, but in participating in a natural evolutionary force that is always helping humanity to refine upon itself. Now, this seems like big concepts. When I talk about humanity, what I'm really talking about is a relationship system in which individuals are all connected under this larger team, one would say, known as humanity. I mean, when we talk about teams, we do understand that when you get a group of people together in a shared agenda, you see them as one unit. And we see humanity as a species. You know, we are part of this larger species, but we're also a shared intelligence. That is, what's happening in us individually is also part of this larger group intelligence or systemic intelligence. So we are a human system, and the way that our system organizes itself is through relationships. So we could call it a relationship systems intelligence. And that's what I want to talk about today, because I've talked about this concept of a great change. But what is really going on in humanity? We see a lot of chaos at the moment. There is a lot of confusion about what kind of structures to uphold, what kind of governance is working, how are we going to mobilize ourselves moving forward in a way that can integrate all these supposed challenges that we have, a lot of them to do with diversity and inclusivity and the impact that different elements or stimulus brings into what was once a kind of tribal way of operating. You see, relationship systems, they've operated since the beginning of time, and some of them remain very consistent. We have a family system, we have a tribal system, we have a workplace system, we have organizational systems, we have national systems. These are all where human beings, there's more than one or two or large groups of human beings, are organizing themselves around a structure, a governance, a principle that then influences the way they use their energy. And I don't want to go too deeply into this. What I want to talk about is the shift that's happening inside these relationship systems. We've had a long period of time in humanity where the main intelligence has been structural. That is, in order for us to evolve, we've been building structures, inventing governance, ways to organize ourselves as a system. And these structures have become very refined over time. But what we have found is that they get very rigid. The idea of a national identity, for example, is a structure that we choose to live through. However, as we get more transport, more ways for people to move around, that old version of what it means to have a national identity cannot hold all the new information, all the new experience that is coming its way. It needs to evolve. And how does it evolve? It evolves by integrating, by bringing this new stimulus inside the system and allowing it to inform the system. And the system then starts to adapt and change. So we see what I would perceive as the end of constructive intelligence. That is, we've built up this entire reality or this world that we've invested in, and we're all operating through these identities that keep this world alive or this reality alive. But those structures are crumbling. They can't hold the level of diversity and the level of evolution that is now putting pressure on it. So we see something new emerging, but it's not a clean, linear experience. What can happen when we feel this limitation coming in on us is a form of annihilation. We may feel that while those old structures are dissolving and dying and crumbling, that we are becoming extinct. But actually that old way of organizing ourselves is becoming extinct. And you may ask, well, what is being revealed? Or at least that's the sort of question that I have been exploring or inquiry for a long time. As we start to make space and allow this old structural way of organizing ourselves being over-identified, for example, with the idea of a national identity, when that starts to dissolve, something else reveals itself. And I'd like to call this continuity. This is what continues to move forward with humanity as humanity evolves. And it's different from constructive intelligence. Continuity is really about how do relationships keep on moving and integrating and evolving and refining and maturing. This is the intelligence of continuity, and it's a deeply feminine intelligence. It's a sort of intelligence that we see in the mother archetype, for example, or we see it in the activist or the advocate or the carer. This type of intelligence, it's looking at how do I sustain and stabilize the relationship enough for it to be able to change and transform. So it's not how do I hold the relationship in place and keep it as it once was. That's a very fundamentalist way of trying to keep relationships and relationship systems and the way humanity organizes and relates to each other in an old paradigm where it's very controlled, it's very separate. But that just doesn't work in our current reality. We see so much synthesis and merging taking place that we need to be able to move along with that process. And that's where we see that continuity. Two parents have a child, and the child is a refinement or a third entity that has come out of those two parents. Now, some parents may try to educate and raise their children as they were educated and raised in order to keep some sort of continuity, the continuity of what was, hoping that it will move forward into the future. But as we know, children are always growing up in a new generation with new influences, and it's really impossible to actually just recycle the child that you once were in the child that you now have. You have to integrate and adapt, and that child becomes a synthesis of what was, but also what is becoming. They're in a new reality, in a new generational profile, and therefore their experience of life is different to that of their parents. So we have both continuity, what we're trying to carry over, and also this influence of the new, which then produces a third outcome, where we get this whole new experience of reality. And every generation is having that experience. We're not simply recycling, we're often refining, or at least regenerating with some newness, some innovation in there. Now, what would be the difference really from regeneration and refinement is the level of consciousness that people are bringing into that process of continuity. So for example, parents, there's a difference between unconscious and unself-aware parenting, and parenting where there has been some conscious effort to consider the impact of a parent on their child, to start challenging some of those preconceived assumptions about what a child needs and what the role of a parent is. And we have seen a lot of turmoil over the last 2 decades around this function of being a parent, and what kind of role is that in our modern societies. So we see how this continuity, this capacity to keep meeting our relationship systems, because when I'm talking about parenting, I'm talking about a human relationship system, and I'm very much talking about that one aspect that is continuous, and that is our capacity to relate. That doesn't go away. However, the nature of how we relate, the relationships that we create, they constantly shift and evolve. The way we relate to our nation or country is very different now to how it might have been for our ancestors. I know myself, having been birthed in one nation, raised in another, left that nation, gone somewhere else, married somebody from another nation, had children in two other nations. It becomes very difficult for me to identify with one national identity, and national identity just loses its relevance when there's too many in the mix. So I've already a representation or a manifestation of how old structures, old ways of organizing and relating just don't meet what is real in front of us, and there's a lot more people out there like me. So we are at a very interesting time where old structures, old paradigms, old ways of relating to each other and relating to our tribes and tribes relating to each other is no longer meeting the actual reality of being human. And of course, we see a rise in old tribal conflict, because when we don't know how to meet what's coming, we tend to revert back into more fundamentalist or traditional ways of dealing with these challenges. So what we need then is a much more supportive focus on what would be called systems readers, a tribe or group of people within humanity who have the capacity to read systemic intelligence, this kind of relational intelligence I'm talking to, and to start to map out what is this intelligence telling us about what humanity is moving into. So if we're going to bottom line it for today, because there's a lot of big concepts that I'm bringing forward here, and actually this is a very new shift in my own exploration. I have been very focused on developing what I would call an education and a toolkit to really upskill people on what it means to be a human being. What is personal agency? What is collective agency? What's the difference between an individual, a society that they live in, and spiritual intelligence, which is just another intelligence again. These are always all working together in the way that humanity as a living intelligence is evolving. Now, what's interesting about this great change is that in the past, and at least in my lifetime and many of my ancestors' lifetime, the way intelligence has evolved has been outward. We've gone out into the world and we're exploring the world. We use science, we use physical exploration, we use art. We've been using all these inner capabilities to try and understand the world out there. And then over the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen a shift where there has been a group of human beings who've turned inwards. We call this involution. That was evolution, going out. Then involution, where they're thinking all those patterns that we're discovering out there in science, through art, through exploration of the world outside ourselves, they may exist within us, within our own psyche. So we have seen this involution of turning inwards to understand what is it to be a human being who identifies as a self, and how is that self constructed, and how much of it is patterned, and how much willpower do we really have? And that's a journey that I have been on for the last 15 years. But what's emerging for me is that there are archetypes in our way of operating, and there is a new archetype that is making herself known to me. We'll call this archetype the conscientious woman, and she's very much the archetype within this systems reader group who is stepping in to meet the system where it's at, humanity where it's at, to identify that continuity intelligence, to listen and interpret what that intelligence is telling us, and to start educating and informing what are the shifts that we need to make to really support this continuity the way that it's showing up. And what we're going to see is a big shift in how we perceive our own power and agency. We're going to see that we are part of this larger system known as humanity, and these tribal systems that we believe we belong to are starting to dissolve and lose their hold or lose their capacity to help us organize ourselves appropriately. That kind of sounds messy, right? It does feel like humanity might become extinct. I know that that feels like a very real possibility, because we're misusing our energy and our agency to continue trying to evolve externally by constructing outwards, discovering more, going to the moon. But we do see this pull towards involution, and I believe that that momentum is going to keep gaining power. But then, of course, once we come back in and we start to understand exactly what our agency is, exactly how systemic intelligence works through us as individual human beings, we'll see that natural tendency to go back out, to evolve outwards by operating in this really systemic way, rather than how it was before in a very tribal or personal way. So this great change, if we wanted to bottom line it, we're going to see the end of this constructive, progressive intelligence. And when that starts to dissolve and fall away, we'll be left with this core intelligence, which is called a continuity intelligence. It's what helps humanity to continue moving forward. But it's not going to be a simple form of continuity where we keep recycling, and regenerating. We're going to be refining. That is, we're going to start elevating that continuity. We're going to take ownership over the process and start to be able to support continuity, not to simply recycle the way we were before, but to start to refine on and to reform in a way where we're no longer acting out in these tribal ways. Because tribalism really causes the kind of violence and conflict and misuse of energy that we're seeing today. Tribalism leads us into wars within an environmental context which really can't afford to have any more gases going into the atmosphere or into the ocean. These kind of questions, we're not really exploring the real impact of war. Of course, we know the impact of war on the people who are involved and also their families and also their tribes. But there is a bigger impact that we're not considering. The earth is already in a very vulnerable state. So an increasing level of toxins going into the atmosphere, going into the dirt, going into the ocean, that's going to create a whole new set of challenges that we're already beginning to feel very acutely. So we need to change the conversation, and that begins with seeing humanity as one large relationship system with its own intelligence, and starting to identify and cultivate those systems readers who can help us understand how to work with this intelligence more skillfully. And I feel that that has been a big calling of mine without me recognizing it. I've worked with a lot of conscientious women over the years. I know myself to be one. It's a very specific profile. These people show up, and they don't show up for themselves. They don't necessarily sacrifice themselves either. They are recruited by systems to enable a system to actually evolve. Now, I'm not going to get into that this session because we've already covered a lot of ground, but I'm just opening up a new exploration, at least in my own life, that I want to share with you. I don't know necessarily where this is going, but I know that we want to really unpack this elevated continuity. What is that? What is it asking of us? I want to reveal this conscientious woman archetype that really begins with the conscientious child, which I believe is a missing inner child in a lot of the work we do in psychology about identifying those inner children and how they work in our lives. We want to come to understand that systems don't just enable, they recruit. They recruit people to fulfill functions that will help the system to evolve. But if those people are not mature and they don't have the skill set, the system will simply recruit people to continue recreating what it's already done. And we see that. We see how tribes recreate the same conflicts and the same violences and try to keep people inside the tribe, not allowing for the natural differentiation that exists when we start to let go of those old rigid identification structures. So this is just such an interesting space to be in, and I'd love to try and make this more simplified. I think that's always been a key DNA in the way that I operate. We want to take these complex concepts, these big processes that are playing out, and start to make them very digestible, very practical. How can I take this intel and go out and live my life in a far more empowered way, or just in a far more aware way? We're really talking here about a significant expansion in awareness about how humanity really works, and not only how it functions, but how it can function in a really high potential way. So we're going to dive really deep into this, but I'll ask for your patience moving forward. I'm still trying to work this out in my own life. I can see this very clearly, but it's very different to be able to understand exactly how things work and to be able to articulate in a way that really engages people in the process. So I'm looking forward to taking this journey with you. So until next time, take care and love life.